This happened in the 1980s, 1986 to be exact. I always figured the job would be boring. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't looking for excitement when I signed up as a park ranger, but after 6 months of watching tourists throw sandwich wrappers into the woods and arguing with campers about fire regulations, you start to wonder if you made the right career choice. My name's Emmett Renford, and back in '86 I was stationed at Acadia National Park in Maine. I was 28 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science and a head full of ideals about preserving nature. I liked the quiet. I liked the solitude, but I never expected to come face to face with something that should have stayed buried in the woods. It was a typical morning in early October, cool and misty, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only one on Earth. The trees were just starting to turn, splashes of red and gold peeking through the evergreens. I was doing my usual rounds, checking campsites for litter, making sure people followed the leave, no trace rules. The crunch of fallen leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a chickadee were the only sounds breaking the silence. That's when I got the call on the radio. The staticky voice of Hank, one of the senior rangers, crackled through. "Emmett, you there? We've got a situation." I pressed the button on my radio. "I'm here, Hank. What's going on?" "Couple of hikers went off trail yesterday. Didn't make it back by sundown. Their car's still in the lot." I sighed. This wasn't unusual. It happens all the time. People think they can wander wherever they please, and it's usually just a matter of following the footprints back to where they veered off. But something in Hank's voice made me uneasy. "I'll head over to the trailhead," I said. "Meet you there?" "Negative," Hank replied. "I need you to meet me by the old fire road, you know the one?" I frowned. The old fire road was barely more than a game trail now, overgrown and rarely used. Not many tourists even knew about it. "Yeah, I know it. Why there?" There was a pause long enough that I thought we'd lost connection. Then Hank's voice came back, quieter this time. "Just meet me there, kid. And bring extra ammo." The radio went silent, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. I made my way to the old fire road, my mind racing. Hank wasn't one to get rattled. He'd been with the park for over 20 years, seen it all. Or so I thought. When I got there, he was standing near the tree line, hands on his hips, staring into the woods like they were hiding something nasty. Hank was in his late 50s, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. He gave me a look that made my stomach drop, and without saying much, we started walking. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The mist hung low, turning the world into a gray haze. Our footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves. "You ever hear about what happened in '73? Hank asked suddenly, his voice low. I shook my head. "No, what happened?" He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether to tell me. "Couple of people went missing, just like this, never found them. Park officials kept it quiet, didn't want it messing with the visitor numbers." I wasn't sure what to say, so I kept quiet and followed Hank deeper into the woods. After about an hour of walking, the trail turned strange. It was like the trees were closing in even more, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air felt thicker, almost hard to breathe. That's when we stumbled on the first sign. A backpack, torn open like it had been mauled by something big. Dark stains that could only be blood smeared the fabric, and not far from it was what was left of one of the hikers. I've seen some bad stuff. People get hurt in the woods, animals don't mess around. But this wasn't an animal attack. The body looked like it had been chewed. Not clawed, not shredded, but gnawed on. Like whatever did it had teeth too big for its mouth. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I forced it down. Hank was examining the remains without touching anything. He didn't seem fazed, which scared me more than anything else. "Guess we know why they didn't come back," he said, his voice flat. I swallowed hard. What? What could have done this? Hank didn't answer. He just stared at the corpse, his face unreadable. Then he reached for his radio. The rest of the search was a blur. We radioed it in, but instead of the usual response, sending a team or alerting the authorities, there was this weird pause. A long silence before the voice on the other end said, "Stay put. Don't go any further." We didn't listen. We kept moving, deeper. I don't know why. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe Hank had seen something like this before and wasn't telling me. All I know is we should have turned back the moment we saw what was left of that poor hiker. But we didn't. As we moved further into the woods, we found more signs. Broken branches, deep grooves in the ground like something massive had scraped through. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals. It was as if every living thing had fled. The second hiker was slumped against a tree, or at least what was left of him. His neck was twisted in a way that wasn't natural, like someone had wrung it out like a wet towel. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly into the mist. I had to turn away, fighting the urge to be sick. Hank didn't say much, neither did I. There wasn't much to say when you're looking at something that doesn't make sense. It wasn't long after that when we heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. Not a growl, not a roar, but something in between. It was like something was dragging itself through the underbrush, branches snapping under its weight. Hank raised his hand, motioning for me to stop. I wanted to ask if he'd heard it before, but the look in his eyes told me he had. We crouched behind a thick tangle of roots, eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it. At first it didn't look like much, just a shadow moving between the trees. But then it stepped into a small clearing, and I felt my heart stop. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even hunched over on all fours. Its body was long and sinewy, covered in what looked like a mix of coarse hair and something that resembled tree bark. The limbs were the wrong shape, too long and jointed in places they shouldn't be. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It didn't have a face, not really, just a flat expanse of leathery skin with 2 sunken pits where eyes should be. And below that, a mouth. A gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, stretching impossibly wide across what passed for its head. I nudged Hank, my hand shaking. For a second I thought he was going to shoot it. But he didn't. Instead he whispered, "It doesn't see us. Don't move." Yeah, easier said than done when you're staring at something that looks like it crawled out of your worst nightmares. The creature sniffed the air, long fingers tipped with dull, worn-down claws scraping the ground as it moved. I noticed they didn't look sharp, more like they had been ground down from... Well, I didn't want to think about what could wear down claws like that. We stayed there, barely breathing, watching it circle the area. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. Then it let out that awful sound again, like a deep, rattling cough, and turned back toward the deeper part of the woods. Hank motioned for me to follow as it moved away, and we did, careful not to make a sound. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but something kept me moving forward. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the grim determination I saw in Hank's eyes. We followed it for what felt like hours, watching as it wandered through the woods, stopping occasionally to scratch at the ground or sniff the air. It was hunting, and from the looks of it, we were next on the menu. Eventually it stopped, and that's when I saw it. It had a nest, or maybe nest isn't the right word. It was more like a pit, a hollowed-out section of earth filled with bones. Not just animal bones either. Human bones. Some fresh, others cracked and worn like they'd been there for years. I whispered to Hank, asking him if this was what he'd seen back in '73. He just nodded, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the trees. "Is this what got those hikers?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Hank looked at me, his eyes haunted. "This thing's been here for decades," he said, "and it doesn't leave. We should have left then. I know that now. But something in Hank told me he wasn't ready to walk away, not without taking a shot at the thing. Maybe he figured he owed it to those hikers. Maybe he wanted to put an end to whatever was lurking in these woods. Either way, he raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot rang out, loud and echoing through the trees. The creature screeched, a sound so piercing it felt like it was tearing through my skull. Its head snapped in our direction, those empty eye sockets somehow finding us instantly. It moved faster than anything I've ever seen, charging at us with those long limbs swinging wildly. I didn't even have time to think. Hank fired again, but it barely slowed the thing down. I was knocked flat on my back, the breath leaving my lungs as it barreled past me and into Hank. It took one swipe, just one, and Hank was on the ground, not moving. I scrambled to my feet, pulling my own gun. I don't know what I was thinking. Shooting this thing wasn't going to do much good, but I had to try. I fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot made it flinch, dark ichor oozing from the wounds, but it kept coming. Its mouth hung open, that impossible maw ready to swallow me whole. Then it stopped. It just stopped, stared at me with that flat, empty face. It tilted its head like it was deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. For a second, I thought maybe it wasn't going to kill me. Then it turned and loped off into the woods, disappearing into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. I ran to Hank, but it was too late. He was gone, his body limp and broken in the dirt. I radioed for backup, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened, but it was no use. By the time they arrived, the thing was long gone, and all they found were the remains. The next few days were a blur of questions and confusion. Park officials swarmed the area, but they found nothing. No tracks, no nest, no sign of the creature. It was like it had vanished into thin air, taking all evidence of its existence with it. They told me not to say anything. Just like in '73, they wanted to keep it quiet. Didn't want the park turning into a ghost town or worse, a hunting ground for thrill seekers and cryptid enthusiasts. But I couldn't keep quiet. Not about this. The nightmares started almost immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, its impossible body, its gaping maw. I heard Hank's last scream, saw the life drain from his eyes. I tried to tell people what I'd seen. My superiors, my co-workers, even a local reporter. But no one believed me. They chalked it up to trauma, to the stress of finding those poor hikers. Some even suggested I might have been the one responsible, that I'd snapped under the pressure and killed Hank myself. The worst part? When they finally dragged me out of those woods, one of the senior rangers looked at Hank's body, shook his head, and said, "This isn't the first time." I guess Hank was right. That thing had been there for decades, maybe longer. I couldn't stay at Acadia after that. I quit my job, packed up my things, and left Maine altogether. But I couldn't escape the memories. They followed me, haunting my dreams and my waking hours alike. For years, I tried to forget. I moved from place to place, never staying anywhere too long. I took odd jobs, anything to keep my mind occupied. But always in the back of my mind, I knew it was still out there. Waiting. Hunting. It wasn't until 1992 that I finally found someone who believed me. I was working as a groundskeeper at a small college in Vermont when I met Dr. Eleanor Winters. She was a professor of folklore and mythology with a particular interest in cryptozoology. At first, I was hesitant to share my story. I'd been laughed at and dismissed so many times before. But there was something about Dr. Winters that made me trust her. Maybe it was the way she listened, really listened, without judgment or skepticism. I told her everything, about the hikers, about Hank, about the creature. As I spoke, I saw recognition in her eyes. She'd heard stories like mine before. "What you encountered," she said after I'd finished, "sounds like what some Native American tribes call a Wendigo. A creature of insatiable hunger, cursed to wander the forest, always seeking its next meal." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But that's just a legend, right? A myth?" Dr. Winters smiled sadly. "Many myths have their roots in truth, Mr. Renford, and there are more things in this world than we can explain with our limited understanding of science." She showed me reports, newspaper clippings, eyewitness accounts, all describing something similar to what I'd seen, going back decades, even centuries, always in the same general area, the forests of the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. "These creatures," Dr. Winters explained, "they're rare, but they're real, and they're ancient. Some believe they're as old as the forests themselves." I felt a mix of relief and terror. Relief that someone finally believed me, that I wasn't crazy. But terror at the confirmation that this thing, this Wendigo, was real, and that there might be more of them out there. Dr. Winters and I spent the next few years researching, gathering more evidence. We never went public with our findings. Who would believe us? But we did what we could to warn people, to keep them safe. Anonymous tips to park rangers, carefully worded warnings posted on hiking forums. But always, in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't enough. That thing was still out there, still hunting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, I'd have to face it again. It was in the summer of 1998 that my fears were realized. Dr. Winters had received reports of increased disappearances in Acadia, hikers going missing, Search parties finding nothing but torn backpacks and inexplicable claw marks on trees. I knew I had to go back. I owed it to Hank, to those hikers, to everyone who'd fallen victim to that thing. Dr. Winters tried to talk me out of it, but she knew as well as I did that I was the only one who'd seen it and lived to tell the tale. So 12 years after I'd fled those woods, I found myself driving back to Acadia National Park. The familiar scenery brought back a flood of memories, not all of them bad. I remembered the quiet mornings, the beautiful sunsets, the sense of peace I'd once found in these forests. But underneath it all was a current of dread. I knew what was waiting for me in those woods. I checked into a small motel on the outskirts of Bar Harbor, using a fake name. I didn't want anyone recognizing me, didn't want to draw attention to myself. The next morning, I headed into the park. It was strange being back. Everything looked the same, and yet everything had changed. Or maybe it was just me who'd changed. I was no longer the naive young ranger I'd been. I was older now, grayer. With eyes I was older now, grayer, with eyes that had seen too much. I made my way to the ranger station, my heart pounding. I didn't know if anyone would recognize me, or what I'd say if they did. As luck would have it, the station was manned by a young ranger I didn't know. She couldn't have been more than 25, with bright eyes and an eager smile. It made my chest ache, remembering when I'd been like that. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. I cleared my throat. "Yeah, I'm looking for information on recent disappearances in the park." Her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't discuss ongoing investigations with the public." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "Look, I used to work here. Back in '86, I know about the thing in the woods." The color drained from her face. She glanced around, then motioned for me to follow her into a back room. "How do you know about that?" she hissed once we were alone. I took a deep breath and told her my story. About the hikers, about Hank, about the creature. As I spoke, I saw the same mix of fear and disbelief I'd seen in so many faces over the years. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There have been more disappearances, 3 in the last month. We've been told to keep it quiet, but people are scared. The locals know something's wrong." I nodded. "I need to go back out there, to where it happened." She shook her head vehemently. "No way, it's too dangerous. We've got teams searching, but they don't know what they're looking for," I interrupted. "I do." She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "I can't stop you, can I?" "No," I said. "You can't." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a map. "Here, this shows where the recent disappearances have been. Be careful, Mr. Renford. Whatever's out there, it's getting bolder." I took the map, my hand shaking slightly. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, she called out, "Mr. Renford? What does it look like?" I paused at the door, the memories flooding back. "Like nothing you've ever seen," I said softly, "and pray you never do." The next morning I set out at dawn. The familiar trail stretched before me, disappearing into the mist. The woods were quiet, too quiet, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the map to the areas of the recent disappearances. They formed a rough circle, centered around the area where I'd encountered the creature all those years ago. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but little of its light penetrated the dense canopy. I found signs of the missing hikers, a torn backpack here, a broken camera there, but no bodies, no blood. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. As the day wore on, I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was chasing ghosts. Maybe the trauma of what I'd seen had warped my memory, made me see monsters where there were none. But then I saw it. A footprint, massive, misshapen, pressed deep into the soft earth. My heart began to race. It was real. It was here. I followed the tracks, my hand on my gun. They led me deeper into the woods, to areas I'd never seen before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and then I heard it. That sound. That awful rattling cough that had haunted my nightmares for over a decade. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly I turned, and there it was, It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its massive form hunched and twisted. In the pale light filtering through the trees, I could see it more clearly than I had all those years ago. Its skin was a patchwork of bark-like scales and matted fur, mottled with strange, pulsing growths. The limbs were even longer than I remembered, jointed in impossible ways. And the face, God, the face. It was like a nightmare given flesh. The skin was pulled tight over a skull-like visage with deep, empty sockets where eyes should be. But it was the mouth that held my gaze, that terrible, gaping maw, filled with row upon row of jagged teeth. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, paralyzed with fear as it regarded me with those empty eye sockets. Did it remember me? Did it even have that kind of intelligence? Then it moved, faster than anything that size had any right to move. I barely had time to dive out of the way as it charged, its claws raking the air where I'd been standing. I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for my gun. The creature wheeled around, its mouth opening in that horrible, rattling roar. I fired, once, twice, 3 times. The bullets struck home, dark ichor oozing from the wounds, but it didn't even slow down. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, its heavy footfall shaking the ground. I burst into another clearing and skidded to a stop. Before me was a sheer cliff face, at least 30 feet high. I was trapped. I turned to face the creature as it emerged from the trees. It moved slowly now, almost leisurely. It knew it had me cornered. As it approached, I noticed something. A scar on its chest, right where Hank had shot it all those years ago. This wasn't just any monster. This was the same one. The one that had haunted my nightmares for over a decade. "You remember me, don't you?" I said, my voice shaking. "You remember what we did to you?" The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. Then it let out a low, rumbling sound, almost like laughter. It was toying with me, playing with its food. I raised my gun again, knowing it was useless but unwilling to die without a fight. The creature tensed, ready to pounce. And that's when I heard it. A voice calling out from the woods. Mr. Renford, where are you?" It was the young ranger from the station. She must have followed me. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Fresh prey. In that moment of distraction, I made a decision. I charged at the creature, yelling at the top of my lungs. It turned back to me, surprised by my sudden aggression. We collided with a force that knocked the breath from my lungs. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through flesh and muscle. The pain was excruciating, but I held on, grappling with the monster as we teetered on the edge of the cliff. "Run!" I screamed, hoping the ranger could hear me. "Get out of here!" The creature roared, its fetid breath hot on my face. We struggled at the cliff's edge, a bizarre dance of man and monster. Then we were falling. The world spun around us as we plummeted. The creature's roar of rage turned to one of fear. We struck the ground with a sickening thud, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in a crumpled heap at the base of the cliff. Every part of my body screamed in pain, but I was alive. Beside me lay the creature. Its body was broken, twisted at unnatural angles. Dark ichor pooled beneath it, but incredibly, impossibly, it was still alive. As I watched, its body began to change. The fur and scales seemed to melt away, revealing pale, human-like skin beneath. The limbs shortened, the claws retracted. And the face became almost human. I stared in horrified fascination as the transformation completed. Where the monster had been, there now lay an old man. His skin was wrinkled and weathered, his hair long and matted, and his eyes were open, filled with a mixture of pain and something that looked almost like gratitude. He opened his mouth, and in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in decades, he whispered, "Thank you." Then he closed his eyes, let out a long breath, and was still. I lay there, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The creature, the Wendigo, had been human once. A man, cursed or transformed into that thing. And I had freed him. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Eventually I heard voices, felt hands lifting me onto a stretcher. The young ranger's face swam into view, her eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Renford, can you hear me? You're going to be okay?" As they carried me out of the woods, I caught a glimpse of where the old man's body had been. but there was nothing there. No body, no blood, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. The next few weeks passed in a haze of hospital rooms and police interviews. My injuries were severe. Multiple broken bones, deep lacerations, internal bleeding. The doctors called it a miracle that I'd survived. The official story was that I had fallen while hiking in a restricted area of the park. There was no mention of the creature, no acknowledgement of the missing hikers. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. But I knew the truth. And so did the young ranger, whose name I learned was Lisa. She visited me in the hospital, her eyes haunted by what she had seen and heard that day in the woods. "What was that thing?" she asked in a whisper, glancing nervously at the door as if afraid someone might overhear. I sighed, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "It's called a Wendigo, an old legend come to life, a man transformed by an insatiable hunger." Lisa shook her head, disbelief warring with the evidence of her own eyes. "But how? Why?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it was a curse. Maybe it was some kind of twisted evolution. All I know is that it's been out there for a long time, and I don't think it was the only one." Her eyes widened. "You mean there could be more?" I nodded grimly. "The legends speak of them in the plural, and the disappearances. They've been happening for too long, over too wide an area, for it to be just one creature." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she asked, "What do we do?" I looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes. She reminded me of myself, all those years ago. Young, idealistic, ready to face the unknown. But I also saw the fear, the understanding of just how dangerous this knowledge could be. "We keep watch," I said finally. "We look for the signs, and we do what we can to protect people, without letting them know what's really out there. Because if this got out, if people knew what was lurking in the woods, it would be chaos," Lisa finished. I nodded. Exactly. Hunters would flood the forest looking for glory or profit. More people would die, and the Wendigos, they'd either be wiped out or driven deeper into hiding. Neither outcome helps anyone. Lisa nodded slowly, accepting the burden of this secret. "I'll do what I can," she promised. As she turned to leave, I called out, "Lisa, be careful. These things, they're patient. They can wait for years, decades even, for the right moment to strike. Don't ever let your guard down." She gave me a small, sad smile. "I won't. Take care, Mr. Renford." After she left, I lay back in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling. I thought about the old man the Wendigo had become in its final moments. Who had he been? How long had he been trapped in that monstrous form? And most chillingly, how had he become that way in the first place? I was released from the hospital a few weeks later. The doctors called my recovery remarkable, but I knew I would never be the same. The scars, both physical and mental, would remain with me for the rest of my life. I couldn't go back to my old life. The thought of returning to those woods, of possibly encountering another Wendigo, filled me with a terror I couldn't overcome. But I couldn't simply walk away either. I owed it to Hank, to the hikers who had died, to do something. So I did the only thing I could think of. I started writing. Under a pseudonym, I began publishing articles about wilderness safety, about the dangers that lurked in the deep woods. I never mentioned the Wendigos directly, but I tried to give people the knowledge they needed to stay safe. I kept in touch with Lisa over the years. She remained at Acadia, keeping a vigilant eye out for any signs of Wendigo activity. Every so often, she would call me about a strange disappearance or an unusual animal sighting. Most of the time, it turned out to be nothing. But sometimes I would feel that old familiar chill run down my spine. As the years passed, I began to hear stories from other parts of the country. A hiker in the Rockies describing a creature that sounded eerily familiar. A hunter in the Appalachians finding strange tracks and half-eaten carcasses. Each time I would pass the information along to Dr. Winters, who continued her research into these creatures. But for every story that reached my ears, I knew there were dozens more that went unreported. People who vanished without a trace, their fates known only to the dark and hungry things that roamed the wilderness. It's been over 30 years since that day in Acadia. I'm an old man now, my hair gray, my body bearing the scars of my encounter. But I can't forget. I won't forget. I've dedicated my life to studying these creatures, to understanding them as best I can. Dr. Winters and I have compiled a vast archive of sightings, encounters, and legends. We've mapped out their territories, tracked their movements as best we can. But for all our efforts, we've barely scratched the surface. The Wendigos remain a mystery, their origins unclear, their true nature elusive. Are they a natural phenomenon, some twisted offshoot of evolution? Or are they something more supernatural, the product of an ancient curse or forgotten ritual? We may never know the full truth. But what we do know is this: they're out there, waiting, watching, hungry. I've trained others over the years, people like Lisa who have encountered these creatures and lived to tell the tale. We've formed a loose network of watchers, keeping an eye on the wild places of the world. We do what we can to protect people, to steer them away from danger without revealing the full extent of what lurks in the shadows. But it's not enough. It can never be enough. For every life we save, for every potential victim we warn away, there are others who fall prey to the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. And now, as I near the end of my life, I find myself facing a difficult decision. Do I take this knowledge, this terrible secret, to my grave? Or do I share it with the world? Consequences be damned. I've written this account, my full and true story, and sealed it away. Perhaps someday, when the world is ready, when we've advanced enough to face these creatures on equal terms, someone will find it. Perhaps then, the truth can come to light. But for now, the secret remains. The Wendigos continue to hunt in the deep woods, in the places where civilization's light doesn't quite reach, and we, the Watchers, continue our vigil. To those who read this, I have one final warning. Be careful in the wild places of the world. Respect the wilderness, but never forget that it holds dangers beyond your imagining. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods hearing a strange rattling cough echoing through the trees, run, and don't look back. For the hunger that drives the Wendigo is eternal, insatiable. And in the dark of the forest, in the shadows between the trees, it waits. Always waiting, always hungry. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as we drove down the winding back roads. The six of us, fresh out of high school and eager for one last adventure before college, chattered excitedly about the camping trip ahead. Little did we know our carefree getaway was about to take a terrifying turn. I was 17 then, a social butterfly always seeking the next thrill. My tight-knit group of friends, my girlfriend Stephanie, my buddy Brandon and his girl Kaylee, and Steve with his girlfriend Sarah, had been through thick and thin together. This trip was our chance to make some unforgettable memories before life pulled us in different directions. But as the miles ticked by and the houses grew fewer and farther between, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The air seemed to thicken with an unspoken menace, hinting at the horrors to come. If only I had heeded that instinct. But in the reckless invincibility of youth, I brushed it aside, eager to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. After hours of driving, we finally found the perfect spot, a secluded clearing deep in the heart of the woods. It was just remote enough to feel like an adventure, but with a few scattered houses nearby to provide a sense of safety. Or so we thought. Piling out of Steve's spacious Honda Pilot, we stretched our cramped limbs and breathed in the crisp forest air. Setting up camp took over an hour as we pitched our 3 tents, one for each couple. As a former Boy Scout, I made sure we had all the essentials: food, water, flashlights, and being rebellious teens, we made sure to pack plenty of booze and weed too. As the tents took shape, Brandon and I ventured into the woods to gather firewood. We stumbled upon a narrow trail snaking into the undergrowth and made a mental note to explore it later. By the time we returned, the sun was setting and it was time to relax. That first night passed uneventfully as we drank, smoked, and laughed around the campfire before eventually slipping off to our respective tents. Stephanie snuggled up close to me and I allowed myself to believe this would be the trip of a lifetime, blissfully unaware of the waking nightmare ahead. The next morning, as Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind for some alone time, Stephanie, Steve, Sarah, and I set off to check out that intriguing trail from yesterday. About 20 minutes in, Steve spotted something ahead, a decrepit metal fence guarding an old cemetery. Approaching cautiously, we saw the cemetery wasn't quite abandoned. Faded flowers and tattered notes were propped against crumbling headstones, hinting at recent visitors. But this was no cultish voodoo hotspot, just a forgotten burial ground slowly being reclaimed by nature. Beyond the graveyard, a wider trail rutted with tire tracks led to what looked like a rudimentary parking area. Curious, we followed the trail a bit farther until a herd of grazing deer startled us with their sudden appearance. It was a peaceful scene, but with daylight fading, we had to turn back before dark consumed the forest. That night, we kicked the partying into high gear, determined to finish off our ample alcohol and cannabis supply so as not to haul it home. The booze flowed, the laughter echoed, and the stars twinkled merrily above. When we finally stumbled off to bed, we expected another peaceful night like the last. But oh, how wrong we were. It was a blood-curdling scream that wrenched me violently from sleep. Disoriented, heart pounding out of my chest, I sat bolt upright as the terrible shriek faded into a gurgle. It was coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. Even as Stephanie and I struggled to free ourselves from our tangled sleeping bags, the unmistakable sound of ripping fabric filled the air. Something sharp was tearing their tent apart. From within, the panicked beam of a flashlight cut erratic paths across the tent fabric. I heard Steve roar in pain and surprise, then the snap and crunch of what sounded like his heavy maglite connecting with flesh and bone. Suddenly, Steve and Sarah came tumbling out of the ruined tent, fear etched across their faces in the moonlight. Our campsite erupted into chaos. Stephanie screamed. Brandon and Kaylee poked their heads groggily out of their tent to see what the commotion was. Frantically, I scanned the perimeter of our little clearing for any sign of the attacker, but the forest remained dark and inscrutable. Steve, thinking quicker than the rest of us, made a beeline for his car, Sarah hot on his heels. He had parked closest to their tent, but farther from ours on the trail. That meant to follow him. The rest of us would have to run right past the spot where the assailant had struck. Even as this realization dawned, the beam of Steve's brake lights cut red swathes through the darkness as his pilot roared to life. We were being left behind. But just before he punched the gas, Steve leaned out the window and yelled a single vital word: cemetery. In a flash, I understood. The trail on the far side of the graveyard was our best avenue of escape. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Stephanie's hand in one of mine and my cell phone in the other. The narrow cone of my phone's flashlight danced frenetically ahead of us as we crashed through the underbrush, Brandon and Kaylee close behind. From somewhere behind us, way too close, heavy footsteps bore down like a predator with our scent. We hit the cemetery at a dead sprint. I practically threw Stephanie over the fence before vaulting it myself. Brandon and Kaylee followed, breathing raggedly. As we plunged into the sheltering darkness between the tombstones, I killed my light. In the renewed blackness, we hunkered down and tried to control our ragged breathing. Where was Steve? It felt like hours waiting there in the dark, but it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. Then, from the direction of the fence, a metallic rattle, the sound of someone climbing over. My heart lodged in my throat as the crunch of heavy footsteps continued toward our hiding spot. There's something about moments of mortal terror that brings everything into razor focus. As those ponderous footsteps drew ever closer, I was suddenly acutely aware of the small Swiss Army knife in my jeans pocket. As if moving of its own accord, my hand closed around the knife. By some horrible luck, the footsteps were coming straight toward me. I could hear the intruder's breathing now, labored and raspy. Unbidden, my mind conjured an image of a hulking figure with a twisted, inhuman face looming over me. I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from whimpering. Another step. He had to be right on top of me now. I held my breath and braced, trying to meld with the earth and headstone at my back. The next step never came. Instead, a long, considering pause. He was listening for us, searching. And then, so close I swear I felt the disturbance in the air. A dark shape crouched down mere inches in front of me. Fight or flight, the most primal of instincts, exploded like a supernova in my brain. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, I lunged forward, drawing the knife from my pocket and burying it to the hilt in what I desperately hoped was his leg. The effect was instantaneous. The figure let out an inhuman howl of agony and crashed to the ground as his leg gave out. Something metallic, something huge, clattered from his grasp. A heartbeat later, twin beams of light knifed through the darkness. A car with its brights on. Steve tearing around the corner of the parking lot. As one, the four of us erupted from our hiding spots and sprinted for the fence. In the chaotic strobe of the car's headlights, I caught a single, terrifying glimpse of our attacker as I hurdled the cemetery gate. A huge, hulking man with a face contorted in rage and pain, one hand clutched to his wounded leg, the other still reaching for the massive machete that lay just out of reach. Then I was in the car, diving headlong into the back seat, dragging Stephanie in with me. Brandon and Kaylee were clambering into the front. The doors were barely closed before Steve stomped the gas, and the pilot's tires screamed as we fishtailed out onto the road. The drive was a blur of terror and relief. The girls wept openly while the guys sat in stunned, exhausted silence, the adrenaline slowly leaching from our systems. We drove aimlessly at first, just needing to put distance between us and that place. After a time, Steve pulled into the first driveway we came across. The porch light flicked on as we approached the door, revealing a small, cozy farmhouse. The door opened before we could even knock, and we found ourselves face to face with a kindly-looking elderly couple. Our ragged, bloodshot eyes and trembling hands told our story for us. Within minutes, they had us inside, pressing warm mugs of tea into our hands, offering us the safety and comfort of their home for the night. We slept poorly, jolting awake at every nighttime sound, but we slept. In the morning, fortified by a hearty farm breakfast and armed with the elderly man's hunting rifle, we returned to our campsite to collect what was left of our ravaged belongings. The police were called. Statements were given. Promises were made to find the monster who had attacked us, but he was never caught. The experience drove a wedge between us all. There were too many memories there, too much trauma bonding us together. Slowly we drifted apart, each seeking to process the horror in our own way. It's been a year now, and yet the memories of that night still haunt my dreams. I see his face sometimes, twisted in agony and rage. I feel the phantom resistance as my tiny knife sank into his flesh, and I wonder always what would have happened if any single factor had been different that night. If there is a lesson in this, it is to never underestimate the darkness that can lurk in the hearts of men. But more than that, it is to cherish the light, the laughter, the love of those close to you. Because in a world where such evil exists, it is those bonds, those moments of joy and connection, that make it all worthwhile. To anyone reading this, I implore you, be safe. Stick to the well-traveled paths and the populated campgrounds. Keep your loved ones close, and always, always trust your instincts. The world can be a beautiful place, but it can also be cruel and terrifying. Walk through it with open eyes and guarded heart, and maybe, just maybe, you can come out the other side intact.